since we already prayed the Divine Mercy Chaplet, which is very appropriate, by the way, for this topic, and so I'd like to say the prayer that is connected with that. Some of you know it, some of you might not know it, but it's what I always say at the end, is the closing prayer after the Divine Mercy Chaplet. Eternal God, in whom mercy is endless and the treasury of compassion inexhaustible, look kindly upon us and increase your mercy in us, that in difficult moments we may not despair nor become despondent, but with great confidence submit ourselves to your holy will, which is love and mercy itself. Amen. Amen. Right? So our hope is really oriented towards Christ, is it not? That grace is really what this discussion is all about. Sanctifying grace, actual grace, and the will of God for each individual. And when Stephanie called me and asked me to do this, I was hesitant because I thought, well, there are a lot smarter people than me. I mean, it's a great privilege that Simon Carrion, as young as he is in this diocese. He has a lot to offer, as you well know. And Father Michael de Palma is also exceptional. There are many exceptional priests in our diocese, and I don't think I'm one of them. But God has called me. God has called me, and it's a gift of God's grace. And ultimately, the topic, predestination and Calvinism, I was caught by that. I thought, well, if somebody asked me, how are you saved? I would say, well, by Jesus Christ, through his passion, death, and resurrection, he has opened heaven after it was closed. And it's through his grace that comes to us in an ordinary way through the sacraments of the church, right? So the celebration of the sacraments is the ordinary way in which God imparts his grace to us. And grace is a freely given gift, an unmerited gift that God gives to each individual so that they can enter into then a relationship in the Holy Trinity. Beautiful if you think about it. Think about that. Through baptism and through the other sacraments, we enter into a loving relationship with God. It's through grace then that makes it possible for all of us to have a relationship with God. Now, I don't know how many of you actually, in regard to this topic, went online and looked in the catechism. Anybody? Let me give you some advice. The question is what matters here, right? Predestination, Calvinism. What is predestination? If you went on Google, Google is a great tool if you know what you're looking for. And Google takes me right to EWTN. I do this all the time. And I only steal from the very best, by the way. But I Googled predestination and Calvinism. And I got a gazillion hits. But I went to the one that I thought was the easiest to understand and the most basic. Jimmy Akin, who has obviously thought about this a very long time. Catholic Answers. And so I downloaded that. And that is what I'm going to present to you today. And I also downloaded another article which I'm going to follow up with so that you can compare and contrast what it is that Calvinists believe or think they believe and what Catholic Church actually teaches in regard to predestination. One of the things that struck me, and I remember that Father Brian Milady, some of you know him, he's a Dominican, he's a teacher, he's a morals teacher in the seminary, once said about the Protestants' view of grace and our view of grace is not that much different. How we understand it, though, is. And so there is this reactionary kind of approach that all too many Protestants have. If it sounds too Catholic, they simply reject it out of hand. And in regard to Catholics now, we become also very defensive. And so when what happens is, all too often, Catholics will when they hear something that sounds like Catholic doctrine coming from another source, well, they also will reject it, because obviously it can't be Catholic. Well, if it's true for everybody. If it's false for everyone. That it's not based on being Catholic or non-Catholic. It's based on what has been revealed by God and taught to us from the sacred magisterium. So the magisterium has the final say in all these things. But the church, the scholars of the church, certainly look at all of these things and try to understand better what it is that Christ is trying to teach us in regard to our faith. So then, we have to have minds open to the Spirit of God, and so that we can understand better what God wants us to know. Now, the acronym, I don't know if any of you have seen this before, is called TULIP, right? Predestination, it says here, means many things to many people. All Christian churches believe in some form of predestination because the Bible uses the term. But what predestination is and how it works are in dispute. There's been disputes about doctrine. I can take you back to the Council of Jerusalem. Peter and Paul had differences in terms of what they should or shouldn't do in terms of dietary laws. And Paul corrected Peter, if you remember correctly, when Peter disseminated and began to feel pressure from the Jewish community, Jewish part of that community, which wanted the Gentiles to follow the dietary laws of the Jews, the precepts. And Paul said, no way, that is in the past. That we are under a new law, the law of grace. And the grace, and God, you couldn't keep the law commandments. What makes you think that they can do the same? So don't fall into this, he said. And to Peter's credit, he listened, and the people were comforted by Paul's words. So then, in Protestant circles, there are two major camps when it comes to predestination: Calvinism and Arminianism. Calvinism is common in Presbyterian, Reformed, and a few Baptist churches. Arminianism is common in Methodist, Pentecostal, and most Baptist churches. Even though Calvinists are a minority among Protestants today, their view has had enormous influence, especially in this country. What do you think? Who settled the East Coast? It was the Calvinists. So they had influence in the formation of this country from the very beginning. This is partly because the Puritans and the Baptists who helped found America were Calvinists, but it is also because Calvinism traditionally has been found among the more intellectual Protestants, giving it a special influence. Calvinists claim God predestines people by choosing which individuals will accept his offer of salvation. These people are known as the elect. How many here are the elect? You ought to raise your hands. You're baptized. They are not saved against their will. This is very important, the will, right? They're not saved against their will. They cooperate with God's grace. It is because God has chosen them that they will desire to come to him in the first place. Those who are not among the elect, the reprobate, how many here are the reprobate? No, nobody's going to raise a hand to that. What a great word, by the way. I love the language. I mean, it really is very expressive. I remember my dad once called me a reprobate. I deserved it too. The reprobate will not desire to come to God, will not do so, and thus will not be saved. So then there are those who oppose God's grace, right? Arminians claim God predestines people by pronouncing, but not deciding, who will accept salvation. He makes this pronouncement using his foreknowledge, which enables him to see what people will do in the future. That's problematic. And when you talk about God as being past or future in any ways, becomes a problem philosophically, because God is neither in the past nor is he in the future. Everything is present to God now. So when God knows the future, what we're simply saying is that he sees everything in the present moment. So when we talk about our own destiny, our own predestination, God certainly does know who will be in heaven and who won't. And that ought to strike in us not only a great concern, but also, in a sense, a fear of offending God. Because there are some here, maybe, who will not be saved, including myself. And that is a great mystery. That's a great mystery. So the debate between Calvinists and Arminians is often fierce, he says. These groups frequently accuse each other of teaching a false gospel, at least on a theoretical level, although on a practical level there is little difference between the two, since both groups command people to have faith alone in order to be saved. And we know that that's a false doctrine. Faith working through grace, correct? Right? The debate is centered on the well-known formula, TULIP. Each letter of this acronym stands for a different doctrine held by classical Calvinists, but rejected by Arminians. The doctrines are total depravity, for T, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. All right? So those five letters stand for those five things. It is important, he says, for Catholics to know about these subjects. First, Catholics are often attacked by Calvinists who misunderstand the Catholic position on these issues. I don't think that we remember historically Calvin was Catholic. So what is his point of reference theologically? Catholicism, whether he likes it or not. Calvin had an axe to grind because of some of the injustices that were committed against his own father in the very real human circumstances of the day, politically, economically, socially, and religiously. There was a lot of disagreements that were going on, and people were disenchanted with what they had experienced through priests and bishops. And those are very real realities for all of us to think about. That our actions, our words, if they don't reflect what we believe, we can cause people to become disenchanted with the very vehicle that God created, the church, for the salvation of sinners, and cause people to reject that very ordinary, the most perfect way to come to Christ. So Calvin was his training was in Catholicism, although he fell off track because he rejected the authority of the papacy and the magisterium, got himself in all kinds of trouble. It is important for Catholics to know these subjects. First, Catholics are often attacked by Calvinists who misunderstand the Catholic position on these issues. Second, Catholics often misunderstand the teaching of their own church on predestination. Boy, isn't that the truth. And you know something? Our pride will sometimes not allow us to say that we don't know. Father Scott Mansfield, my very good friend, and you know Father Scott? We play golf together. By the way, I hit a 300-yard drive with a 3-wood yesterday. I want you to know. Father Scott was telling me about an incident that happened to him after a funeral yesterday, or today, I'm sorry. And he was confronted by a man who didn't like the fact that he said at the beginning of his homily, for this young girl, or not young girl, this woman who had been murdered. You might know who that is, or what that's all about. She was murdered by an ex-boyfriend, and he said, first he says, we are called to pray for this person. And every opportunity, you see her picture, you think of her, you pray for her because she needs your prayers. Which tells us what? That it's possible for our prayers to have a positive impact on those who have died. Well, there was a disagreement with that. And in the church, this man confronted Father Scott and was very aggressive. And Father Scott's a better man than me, because I have a bad temper. Sometimes I have to go to confession all the time. I mean, every day. Sometimes I say things that I'm sorry for later. But Father Scott said, at this moment, after a brief discussion, he said, you know what? I have things to do and you're making me angry. I'll talk to you later. Because he was not really interested in discovering what Catholics believe. He was only stating what he thought was wrong with the church. He never listened. And that must never be we must never be like that. We have to listen to people and respond to them intelligently. And if we don't know something, then we should be willing to say, I'll get back to you. And we've heard that many times. But sometimes our pride won't allow us to tell people, I don't know. And I'll tell you, there's a lot that I don't know. And those who are, have been trained will tell you the more they learn, the more they know they don't know. Right, Father? I mean, that's true, huh? So, third, he says, in recent years, there has been a large number of Calvinists who have become Catholics. By understanding Calvinism better, Catholics can help more Calvinists make the jump. And isn't that the idea? Isn't that the whole motive for learning your faith? So that you can share it with others and then help them to make that jump, to come to that conclusion on their own terms? I mean, if you ask Scott Hahn, I'm sure that as he studied, the more he studied, and the more he realized that God had founded the Catholic Church, how difficult that was for him, especially in regards to his livelihood, his family, his wife, her family. Saint John Henry, is it Blessed John Henry Cardinal? Blessed or Saint? I can't remember. Is he canonized? Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman?
He's blessed.
Is he canonized or beatified?
Beatified.
Beatified. See? You know that his family rejected him? They said, we don't want anything to do with you anymore. He lost his prestigious job at Oxford University and became a simple parish priest. Why? Because he understood that he could no longer deny the truth of what he had been studying. And so for people it can be very difficult. That's why it's important for us to learn these things and to look into them. And this short talk that I'm giving tonight is not even going to it's just the beginning. And if you want to know more, you have to do it on your own. You have to start looking. When you ask yourselves questions, when questions arise in your mind, go and find out. And the internet, while it has lots of trash on it, is full of very good things. That the articles and papers that have been written by intellectuals and people whose business it is to know these things. All right, so the first letter, T, total depravity. That's a nice start, isn't it? And we would understand it better, by the way, as original sin. How many of you thought deeply about original sin and the effects of original sin? And what did original sin do, by the way? It cut us off from God, because the preternatural gifts of law, sanctifying grace, was no longer present. So despite its name, he says, the doctrine of total depravity does not mean men are always and only sinful. Calvinists do not think we are as sinful as we possibly could be. They claim our free will has been injured by original sin to the point that unless God gives us special grace, we cannot free ourselves from sin and choose to serve God in love. We might choose to serve him out of fear, but not out of unselfish love. All right. Do you disagree with that? Have you thought about that? How many of you have actually heard of actual grace? You know what sanctifying grace is, right? What do we receive at baptism? What is given to us, again, an unmerited free gift of God to each soul who is baptized? Sanctifying grace. But before that moment, there's this thing called actual grace, and St. Augustine would be happy to teach you on that subject ad infinitum. If you read his stuff, you'll know that he goes on and on and on. But he gets the point across. So actual grace then is what the term is for those who, it is the grace of conversion. It is what inspires a person, a soul, to turn towards God and turn away from sin. It comes with the help of God's grace. So then, what would a Catholic think of this teaching? While he would not use the term total depravity to describe the doctrine, he would actually agree with it. The accepted Catholic teaching is that because of the fall of Adam, man cannot do anything out of supernatural love unless God gives him special graces to do so. And that's what it's just talking about, actual grace. Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas declared that special grace is necessary for man to do any supernaturally good act, to love God, to fulfill God's commandments, to gain eternal life, to prepare for salvation, to rise from sin, to avoid sin, and to persevere. So all these things then, that these virtues that God calls us to live out in love are the result of his grace working in a soul that cooperates with him. That if the grace is not there, it is not possible to please God. It is not. And how often do you hear people say, and unfortunately too many Catholics will say, I'm a good person. That is a non-starter with me. That doesn't mean anything. We're all good persons because God said so when we were created. He didn't say we were good. He said we were what? Very good. But that doesn't mean we can save ourselves through any good works or deeds that we might do. It's only Christ who saves. And he calls us to union with God through the sacraments of the church. That's how grace works. Sanctifying grace, actual grace, all those graces are meant for the salvation of souls. And so, yes, we are in a state of original sin, brokenness, and which requires God's grace to heal the division, the divide that is insurmountable. And if you go to the scriptures and read them, as I was looking at some of these things, it said, there's one of the questions asked of Jesus, and I forget the gospel, will few be saved? And Jesus doesn't say, oh no, everybody is saved. He doesn't say that. He says that there are many called, but few will be chosen. Right? So there are those who will be rejected. And remember that God knows everything. And there's a great mystery and involved with this reality that some will be lost and some will be saved. So then, total depravity is the first one. The second part of this is unconditional election. The doctrine of unconditional election means God does not base his choice, election, we're part of the elect, his choice of certain individuals on anything other than his good will. It is God's will that you be saved. Right? So it's his choice. God chooses whomever he pleases and passes over the rest. The ones God chooses will desire to come to him, will accept his offer of salvation, and will do so precisely because he has chosen them. Jesus says, "It is I who chose you." When he's talking to the apostles, it is I who chose you, not you who chose me. I reached out to you. You responded, but you didn't choose me. And that's true for all of us who have been baptized, who are working out our salvation with fear and trembling with the help of God's grace. It is God's initiative. We must always remember that. It's always God's initiative. So this is what, in a sense, this is what the Calvinists believe. To show that God positively chooses rather than merely foresees those who will come to him, Calvinists cite passages such as Romans 9:15 through 18, which says, "The Lord says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So it depends not upon man's will or exertion, but upon God's mercy. So then, he has mercy upon whomever he wills, and he hardens the heart of whomever he wills." And somewhere else in Paul's writings, Paul mentions that, and he says, "And you would say that God is unfair." No, he's not. God is infinitely just and merciful. The mystery of his saving grace is again something that we have to submit our wills to his. So what would a Catholic, he says, say about this, about that reality? That he saves whom he wills and he hardens the hearts of whomever he wills. That God is certainly free to disagree with the Calvinist that a Catholic is certainly free to disagree with the Calvinist interpretation, but he is also free to agree with it. All Thomists, and even some Molinists, such as Robert Bellarmine and Francisco Suarez, taught unconditional election. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "God wills to manifest his goodness in men, in respect to those whom he predestines by means of his mercy, in sparing them, and in respect of others whom he reprobates by means of his justice in punishing them. This is the reason why God elects some and rejects others. Yet why he chooses some for glory and reprobates others has no reason except the divine will. Hence Augustine says, why he draws one and another he draws not. Seek not to judge, if thou dost not wish to err." There is a good something for us to think about. When we talk about predestination, we can fall into a very human error. If God has already predestined me to be saved, then why should I do anything? And if he's already rejected you because you're Catholic or because of this or because of that or because you're living a sinful life, you are rejected. And therefore, there's no hope for you. So if we have the wrong kind of thinking in regard to predestination, then what is the reason for faith at all? Or hope for that matter?
It mentions that God will harden the hearts of those who shall not be saved. So if someone's already living a sinful life and they're trying to redeem themselves, would their heart be hardened? Or if they continue doing so, their hearts have been hardened?
That's a good question, really, because remember, I've talked to you about actual grace. This is a very important point. Actual grace is the grace of conversion, right? So God waits. That is a great poem, The Hound of Heaven, by Francis Thompson. It'll take you a year to read it. It's very difficult to understand. But in that poem, he calls God the hound, and the hound is constantly pursuing. He can't get away from him. And so this idea that God hardens the heart is, I don't quite understand that, honestly, but I do know that people do. I do know that people are presented with a choice, and that sometimes they don't choose God. they choose themselves or their sinful pleasures instead. And so in regard to that, I don't know if I've answered your question, except I know that people can reject God, and that through their own free choice, right? But it's not because God hasn't given them an opportunity. Now, in terms of gifts of grace, I mean, you look at somebody like, who would I pick? St. Francis de Sales. We just had his feast day. And I pulled out his biography and read it. What a man, right? But it seems like from the very beginning, his mind, his heart was oriented towards God and the service of God. St. Thomas Aquinas is the same. What is it about St. Thomas Aquinas, about St. Francis de Sales, and so many others who seemed like throughout their entire lives, they always cooperate with God? And then you have somebody like St. Augustine, who for the first 30 years of his life was a reprobate. He was lost. But at a certain moment in time, God broke through. And now we have probably the greatest of the Western Fathers. In my opinion, I don't think there's anybody who is comparable to Augustine, although there might be some who might disagree in the East, right? So you have Basil and, yeah. That's an argument that I don't think I'd like to, that I would like them, I like them all. But I prefer Augustine, and maybe it's because I relate to him,
I guess I understand, because in one of the passages in Exodus, every time the Pharaoh was given a choice to release the Jews,
doesn't.
God hardened his heart.
Mm-hmm.
It's mentioned over and over again. Right,
Judas. It's a mystery. And you know what John Paul II said? The mystery of iniquity, the mystery of evil. They fulfilled God's plan, but it's not God's will that they be lost, because then he wouldn't be God.
It says that in order to show his glory,
Yeah.
God hardened his heart, so that they see that that's God's power that brought them out,
Mm-hmm.
not the will of the Pharaoh.
Yeah. It's a mystery, right, Father? I mean, you think about that, because he could have cooperated, he didn't, and God would have been glorified in that. Just think how God would be glorified at the conversion of so many sinners. And this is what St. Francis de Sales accomplished in his time as both a priest and a bishop in Geneva. You read about St. Francis de Sales, he was something else. Yes?
I think it has more to do with free will, because what's happening here is,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about that instance with the Pharaoh, is that Moses keeps on going back. And so the Pharaoh is given that choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's not just that his heart is being hardened,
Mm-hmm.
that's who he is.
Mm-hmm.
He's arrogant. And so God is working with that material of arrogance. If the Pharaoh isn't open to listening,
Mm-hmm.
then
That's his fault. Yeah.
I was going to say, and I think it's very important that the book of 1 Samuel, Father Simon wasn't able to make it here this evening. But when he was going over that, he said, well, if you jump forward just a couple more books, it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
anything that he hadn't already done. That was
Very good
occurring.
point. That's right. What you bring up about free will is also very important in regard to what we believe about predestination. That St. Augustine says that God created us without our cooperation. He will not save us without our cooperation. And so that's the mystery, because the Calvinist argument is that if God allows free will, then he is submitting his will to ours. Well, what did Christ do? If Christ had not been born, if Christ had not come, our time here is wasted. If he had not suffered and died, then we are the most pitiful, as St. Paul says. So then God submits to us in the person of Christ in many ways, yet he's leading us to conversion through his own passion, suffering, and death. Right? And this is, again, when we're talking about the very the very real issues that exist between Catholics and non-Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals. They won't call themselves Protestants anymore because what are you protesting against? God? No, the Catholic Church. So everything that they do, almost, in regards to these kinds of things, is in reference to the Catholic Church. Think about that. And so their understanding or their beliefs are ultimately oriented towards proving that the Catholic Church is wrong. Well, that's really not a good place to start. I'll get free.
Thanks.
You know, when the Catholic Church was founded by Christ to be the place where souls can be saved through the sacraments of baptism, water in the Spirit, born again in the Spirit, and then ultimately entering into a relationship with Christ through the sacramental life of the Church. I'm going to share with you a couple of things in the Catechism after I'm finished. I don't want to go too long, those are all good questions, though. So the limited atonement then is. Did I do that already?
No.
Okay. Let me go back to the unconditional election, and I'll read for you from the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent stated, "If anyone says that it is not in the power of man to make his ways evil, but that God produces the evil as well," and there's the answer to your question, as the good work,